Thanks everyone for joining. I know it's been a while since we've had our last partnership meeting, so thanks for hopping on, and I hope this virtual format will work for folks, at least for now. Some quick housekeeping things. Thanks for entering your name and affiliation in the chat box or just in your name on GoToMeeting. I think that's a nice way for us to still be able to network and gauge who is on the call. So thanks for doing that. Please just keep yourselves on mute while folks are presenting. That way we can minimize noise and make things go more smoothly. Towards the end, we'll have more of an option for a question and answer where we can be a little bit more collaborative in that sense, but I think this will be good for now. As far as cameras, it's up to you guys if you'd like them on or off. I know sometimes it can mess with bandwidth, but it's certainly nice to see your faces. And then if you have any technical questions or something's not working, please use the chat box, and myself and Shannon with Rivers Edge West are going to be kind of monitoring that to make sure everything's working. And same with Q&A. If you guys have any questions while any of the presenters are speaking, just go ahead and enter those in there and we'll get to those as well. And also, hello, my name is Rika Fulton. I work with Rivers Edge West, and I co-coordinate the Dolores River Restoration Partnership with Emily. So I live here in Grand Junction, and I also coordinate the Desert Rivers Collaborative and some projects here in the Grand Valley on the Colorado River. So I don't think I've met some of you yet, so hopefully we can do that sometime soon. So far, some goals we have today are just providing some updates from Emily and I about what's been going on the Dolores and with the partnership. You know, that includes implementation and monitoring and, you know, what funding breakdown that we have, as well as some other updates. We'll also get a chance to hear from the 4 BLM field offices that work on the Dolores as to their activities and priorities. So it's always good to get a chance for those folks to network. And then kind of the bulk of our presentation today is we really want to highlight the recent Dolores River Hydrology Assessment, which is a project developed by Kevin Hyatt, who's a hydrologist with the Grand Junction BLM field office, and completed by our contractors from HDR. So we're really excited to be able to share this resource with you all, because I think it could be useful for a lot of you folks, from, you know, nonprofits to academics, or really anyone interested in the river. So yeah, we'd like to share that with you and make sure everyone's aware of it. And then at the end, we kind of want to provide a space for anyone who's interested in discussing Russian knapweed along the Dolores. That's been a huge issue these last years. So this is a good platform to coordinate and just have an open discussion about that. Oops. So I know at the last partnership meeting in Moab, there was a lot of discussions about kind of revamping of the subcommittee structure and working groups, and I know, like, we haven't really been operating under that governance structure for a little bit. So we kind of wanted to take a step back and have folks fill out this Google form, which Shannon's gonna pop a link to that in the chat box for me. And that just kind of gauges who's interested in maybe becoming more engaged with us, you know, just kind of in a non-formal way, whether that be implementation, monitoring, or stewardship, fundraising. So we'd really appreciate if everyone could take the time to fill that out either right now or after the call. It's just a few questions. And also, if folks didn't know this picture, we have a new sign at the confluence of the San Miguel and the Dolores. So if you're ever driving on the Y11 road, you can check that out. Okay, just some quick resources. So we recently developed this Dolores River Restoration story map, which we're really excited about. Some of you may have seen it already, but it really helps share some information and all of this spatial data that we have. Like, through the years, we've amassed so much good data and spatial data, but some of it's kind of hard to pick through. So Emily and I have pulled some of that out so it's more accessible. And you can visualize it all in the story map, which is also, there's a link to that in the chat box as well. And that includes treatment data, so you know, what secondary weeds and tamarisk treatments have occurred and when, and by who. It has invasive species inventory, so when we have crews out there, they're taking GPS points of where various noxious weeds and woody invasives are, so that's you can find all that there as well. Links to the rapid monitoring data that Emily's crews have collected. She'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's kind of fun. There's also photo points, so you can click up and down and see pictures along the whole river. And then there's also a bunch of other stuff, links to reports and other information, land ownership. So yeah, when you guys have time, go poke around in there. And then we also have an annual event with wildland restoration volunteers here in a few weeks, which will be the 4th or maybe even 5th year that we've partnered with them. So they've done a great job organizing for that. Just a nice small event where we'll be focused on some revegetation and planting cottonwoods and box elders and some shrubs along the river outside of Gateway. So we're excited about that. Some additional updates from some of our partners. We've been working with Gigi Richard from Four Corners Water Center at Fort Lewis, and she's done an awesome job spearheading this effort called the Adaptive Management Support Project, which encompasses geomorphic monitoring on the Dolores, which will be conducted by students from Fort Lewis College as well as Colorado Mesa University, and as well as our DRRP strike teams. So we're super excited about that, as well as the project includes developing the protocol to begin with. So that's kind of a longer term project that will be pretty fun. And then another kind of big picture effort that we've been starting to engage in is active revegetation planning. We're hoping to acquire some funding and resources to get a contractor to help us develop a plan for this that's really detailed and can help us direct our revegetation efforts in a more thoughtful way, you know, including considerations like what species to plant, what methods might work out best for that specific area, given the hydrologic variability of the Dolores, as well as drought and climate change. So that's another long-term effort that we're looking forward to engaging with. And I think that's about all I have for you guys before I turn it over to Emily. Again, enter any questions in the chat box and we'll get to those. And thanks.
All right. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just to reiterate, if you're just getting on the call, please put your name and affiliation in the chat box, just so we know who's on the call. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Cassian, and I'm with the Southwest Conservation Corps, and I co-coordinate this partnership with RICA. So yeah, I'm going to talk about what we've been doing on the ground. So for one thing, 2019, I think the biggest thing that maybe happened for this partnership is RICA came on. So we haven't had a partnership meeting since then. This is the first one. So I think that's really exciting. I know it's been, you know, over a year since then, but just want to put that out there that was a huge, awesome thing that happened in 2019. But yeah, as far as on the ground, these numbers are also in our annual report that just came out. So definitely check that out. It kind of goes into more depth here. So just real quick, in 2019, you can see sort of the big picture, what we accomplished. I want to point out that we did engage all three of our Conservation Corps partners. So that's Canyon Country Youth Corps, Western Colorado Conservation Corps, and the Southwest Conservation Corps in doing initial tamarisk removal, as well as with strike doing resprouts and the secondary weeds. I think a big highlight here is we removed almost 300 acres of tamarisk resprouts, which is like a pretty big accomplishment, I think. Really shows that we're diving into this maintenance work and really, you know, sticking to that plan. So I'm really stoked on that. We also did a lot of secondary weeds last year, mostly Russian knapweed. So we're really making sure that these sites are, you know, continuing on a good trajectory towards restoration success. We did rapid monitoring last year. So just to recap on what that is, that's our rapid vegetation assessment, going to every site that's had treatment and assessing how the site's responding to treatment, seeing if tamarisk is coming back, what secondary weeds are coming in. So this involves a assessment of cover, an invasive species inventory, photo points, a passive recruitment assessment. So if you're interested and want to dive a little bit more into what all that data is, head over to that story map because that stuff's in there. Again, the link's in the chat. And then, yeah, another big highlight for last year is we started work in the wilderness study area. So we're going to talk more about that during BLM field office updates, but that was a pretty big thing as well. And then, yeah, we had some volunteer events last year. So we had the wildland restoration volunteers out again, and we did a ton of stuff over that 3 days. It was great. We finished a baffle in Paradox Creek. We treated tamarisk resprouts. We caged cottonwoods. We installed that interpretive sign. So yeah, if you're ever in the Paradox Valley area, definitely head down Y11. This interpretive sign is at the confluence with the San Miguel, and it's pretty sweet. So you should definitely check it out. Yeah, and then we also engaged the Paradox Valley Charter School and the Gateway School, and planted some cottonwoods and box elders and some native shrubs on 2 different sites. So yeah, last year was a big year. We got a lot done, and yeah, super proud of everything, and thanks to everyone involved. All right, next slide. Cool, thanks, Rika. So I'm gonna just broadly go over what we have done this year and what the plan is for the fall. We will definitely dive more into sort of the details of this stuff when we do our BLM field office updates. But yeah, this year we've had strike teams both from Western and the Southwest Conservation Corps doing work this winter, spring, and summer. I just want to say that I'm super thankful to all the extra work that had to go in to making this year happen, given this year and the craziness. And we've been able to have crews out safely and successfully. And so I just think that in and of itself is a huge accomplishment. But yeah, we've had those strike teams out. Kyle and Cameron have done a bunch of work. So yeah, we've been removing tamarisk resprouts and initial stands near the cement bridge in the Uncapped field office area. Did some white treatment, Siberian elm, some seeding with those crews. We also did rapid monitoring this year in the Grand Junction field office, and then in the Moab field office on those sites you can reach from the state line. So yeah, we were able to finish all that monitoring on all of the sites. And then moving into sort of this fall, we've got fall crews already on the ground, both with Canyon Country Youth Corps and with Western. So we've got tamarisk removal already happening out there, as well as treat and resprout. Let's see, the SEC strike team is already on the ground for this fall as well. So they've been out in the Tres Rios area doing a bunch of Russian knapweed. They will also be doing tamarisk grease sprouts and some active re-veg. And yeah, then we've got a wild restoration volunteer event planned for next weekend, actually. So yeah, it's a busy fall, as always. And oh yeah, we're gonna have our Western Colorado strike team as well, starting this fall. So Kyle and Cam will be out there supporting crews and doing the good work that they do. All right, you can move slides now, Rika. Sorry, I prompted you and then backpedaled. Okay, so let's talk about funding and sort of how, yeah, we're able to, you know, get the money to do all this awesome work. So just to recap what happened in 2020 as far as funding, you can see here that over half of our sources were either from the state of Colorado or from Utah, the Watershed Restoration Initiative. So big thanks to those big state funding sources. They yeah, really enable us to do a lot of good work. The BLM is a big chunk as well, so thanks for all the folks there that helped make that happen. And then we sort of up the remaining 25% of our funding with these smaller sources. So the Walton Family Foundation helps us out with our rapid monitoring. And then we've got Restore Our Rivers, Southwest Basin Roundtable, the Southwest Water Conservation District, Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and the Telluride Foundation to sort of round out the funding there. So it's pretty diverse, and yeah. So moving into 2021, see here. So we have some big sources pending for 21. So you can see here that we have about $170,000 secured for next year. A lot of that is BLM and those state funds again, and Walton Family Foundation's a chunk of that as well. So let's see here. Our pending sources here are more BLM funding. So we have BPS proposals out. Hopefully we hear about that soon. And then we have this big proposal out with the Katina Foundation. And so Rika mentioned that we are looking at doing some in-depth active revegetation planning. And so that proposal is hopefully going to fund that effort. Also, this Katina Foundation money will help with the effort in the wilderness study area and hopefully really tackling the tamarisk that's left in there. So yeah, really our pending sources are going to cover a lot of the Conservation Corps SAW work and some strike team work for next year, but we still have a pretty big funding gap. Even with those sources. Our biggest gap, I want to say, is for our strike teams and doing that maintenance work. As we all know, that's so important to have our sites, you know, on that trajectory we need. So yeah, we're looking at a couple options here. You can see our prospects are listed below here. So those are sort of what we're looking at moving into 2021 to help with that funding gap. Yeah, I don't know, Kristen, Rika, is there anything y'all want to say about 21 funding that I didn't cover?
No, I think that covers it pretty well. You know, we can probably anticipate more from the BLM sources as well as they go into their next fiscal year. And yeah, Kristen's been awesome about looking and doing research at some additional sources we can continue to diversify funding and working with other partners. But yeah, this covers it pretty well.
Yeah, I would just add that if any of you partners have thoughts or funding programs that are new or not listed here, we would love to hear about them to help us cover this gap. I understand that, of course, the pandemic has affected a lot of budgets, and I think we'll see that going into next year. So I suspect the pie chart that we just saw will look a little bit different as some of those funding sources are affected by the current realities. But if you have knowledge of other programs or opportunities or unspent funds, please do contact us, because we would love to take advantage of any opportunities that come up.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. All right, we're doing good on time. So now we're going to roll into the BLM field office updates. And yeah, we'll start upstream and go downstream. So we have Garth Nelson with Trace Rios field office, who will provide updates for his field office.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yep.
So this year, one of the things that got done is there was a mapping exercise done, and they thought there was a lot of Russian olive from about Duck Creek to the pump stations to the pyramid, and the strike team was able to get in there and confirm that was just buffalo berry, so that was good. Again, we have the strike team here this late summer and fall. They're in Little Glen Canyon right now, doing active cameras and Russian olive removal, as well as secondary weed infestation treatments. If we get a boating season in the future, we do have our Fish and Wildlife consultation done, where they conferred with our findings, so we can, if there's a boating season, we'll be ready to start treating cameras in our upper end of the WSA. So, yeah, things to look forward to, and a lot of maintenance of secondary weed infestations around the Gypsum Valley boat launch. And if no one has been to the Gypsum Valley boat launch recently, our recreation staff has just got done updating that pretty extensively. Some really nice shade structures and parking areas and fencing. So pretty exciting for out there to be ready for future seasons. That's about it for Trace Rios.
Great. Thanks, Garth. Yeah, you've been doing a great job up there. Okay, next. Emily, are you going to cover for Ken? I don't know if I saw him on here.
I don't see him on here. Why don't we go ahead with the other offices, and maybe he said he might be able to get on around 10:30. So
Okay.
he'd skip ahead and maybe he'll get on in time.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, we'll go ahead, and Marlon, if you wouldn't mind going next, that'd be great.
Did you say Marlon? Sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
So I don't have too many updates for the group. We're just now starting to switch your gears to focus on the Dolores. Kyle is on. He's kind of been a one-man weeds crew this summer, and then Cam is hopping on with you guys next week. So that'll be great to have both of them working together. And we're just going to be focusing right now on Russian knapweed in the fall, and then once it gets a little bit colder, they'll start focusing more on tamarisk reef sprouts. So that's kind of our game plan. Yeah, this year has definitely been challenging for our field office just because of COVID and trying to hire during this time help for spring. We weren't able to get a second person to help them during the summer, so I'm glad we were able to get Cam back. And another update that we wanted to give you guys is that Kyle will be with our field office since they released an authority saying that we can keep our seasonals on till December 3rd. So I think that's really all I have for you guys. And also I wanted to say thank you for Montana. I know some of his people are out helping Kyle today out in Gateway spray weeds. So thanks, Montana, for your help. And that's it.
Yeah, no problem, Marlon.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. Love the coordination. Okay, so let's go ahead. If Gabe, you wouldn't mind giving updates for the Moab field office, that'd be great.
Yeah, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, sound good.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. So just by way of introduction, my name is Gabe Bissonette. I'm the aquatic ecologist for the Canyon Country District of BLM over on the Utah side. So that's the Moab and Monticello offices. But certainly we have the last piece of the Dolores before it drains into the Colorado. And so, you know, we're working under a WRI proposal right now. And as was mentioned earlier, we've been pretty successful in getting WRI money, largely due to the collaborative nature of the project. You know, we've got collaboration obviously with Rivers Edge West here and the partnership, several of the conservation corps, Grand County Weed Department, WRI, and a fair amount of other partners as well. Probably too long to list here, but so I think because of that partnership, we've been able to successfully compete for some of these dollars and keep things moving forward. And a big focus of the last couple of years has been on a couple of key areas on our side, primarily centered around these large cottonwood galleries that we have. We have some pretty old cottonwood stands, and they're a bit high and dry now, but there's a fair amount of ladder fuels underneath them, you know, mostly tamarisk, a little bit of Russian olive. So we've been kind of in that initial removal phase, both kind of up by state line and then closer to the confluence down in an area called Roberts Bottom. So I've really been trying to just chip away at removing those and kind of clearing out that competition and the kind of risk for fire. Also maintaining resprouts on these sites. Each year we take a bite, we kind of revisit the previous work and make sure that, you know, things are looking good there and try to hit any resprouts that may have popped up in the interim. So continuing to do work on those areas. I guess one notable thing up by state line is sorry, my dogs are scratching at the door here. Anyway, but the berm site, we were able to remove a chunk of that berm, and it was inundated for the first time in decades. Last season, I was able to get some drone footage of that, and some of us were able to kind of take a look at the aftermath of that, and we're seeing some pretty positive results, particularly, you know, cottonwood, at least cottonwood seedlings popping up. I don't know if they were able to resist this year being so dry, but hopefully longer term, we'll see some of those kind of stay and persist through time and get a little bit bigger. We've also seen sedges and rushes come in there, seen a lot of wildlife use. We had fish in there, although they were non-native. But if we can get another good season of inundation in this sort of abandoned oxbow that we've reconnected, we're going to do some fish sampling with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources and see if any of our native and or endangered, well, or sensitive and or endangered fish are utilizing that. So kind of exciting area, seeing some good results after having reconnected that hydrology a little bit and hoping that we get some decent years to keep flow in there and sort of keep pushing that site into a little bit better condition. The other piece I guess I haven't talked about is the section of our river that is only raft accessible. And, you know, we did have a raft trip that was lined out this year, had to cancel it just because of the low flows. But, you know, that's something that we hope to continue to do, water pending. And so hopefully next spring we'll be able to get out there and do a little bit more work and just keep kind of chipping away at that middle section as well. That's certainly been logistically much more difficult and one that we might achieve every other year, you know, every 2 years sometimes, depending on flows. But basically trying to take little bites out of the section of the river that we have, and primarily just initial removal at this point. You know, we still have a fair amount of tamarisk that we have to address, and but I'm really interested in this Russian knapweed discussion because certainly that's something we have to deal with, and I'd be curious to see what's working for other folks as we sort of, you know, think about here in Moab getting through this initial removal phase and starting to think about secondary weed infestations and things like that. And also, you know, once we do get these tamarisk removed and see what's coming in passively, starting to kind of formulate a more cohesive active re-veg plan, which I guess was kind of discussed earlier too. That's certainly on the radar as we get a little bit further down the road here. What else do I have for y'all? I think that's mostly, yeah, we do have some rapid monitoring going on as was mentioned earlier. And thanks, Emily, for getting that off the ground. It's been nice to kind of take a look at some of the sites that we've done previously and see where they're at. So, we're trying to, I guess, keep everything moving forward from the initial removal to the monitoring and kind of documenting what we're doing. But so far, so good. We haven't seen too many hits yet with funding, and hopefully WRI will continue to come through for us. I guess that remains to be seen, but so far so good for the next year or so, and we'll see what happens after that. And that's about all I have, unless you guys have any follow-up questions for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe.
Yeah.
Anyone have questions for Gabe before we hop on over to Ken? Okay, we'll have a chance later too. So I saw Ken get on for some updates for the Uncapped Gray field office.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good. Thanks, Ken.
Okay, so in Uncapped over the last year, I'd say the biggest thing that we have to report out on is we started to tackle tamarisk inside the Dolores River Canyon WSA last fall. We utilized a horse packing outfit to pack in a crew, and we started tackling some of the low density tamarisk up in the Dolores River Canyon WSA and started moving down from LaSalle Creek towards the Bedrock Boat Launch. Another big thing that we've been doing is we have some very dense, thick stands in the WSA that logistically and economically doesn't make sense to try to tackle by hand. So I've been working with Stan Smith along with Rika and Emily to try to figure out a way if we can feasibly get mechanical equipment in the WSA to mulch up that tamarisk and perhaps tackle it in a meaningful time frame as well as in an economical approach. And Stan reported out that indeed it looks like we can get equipment in there. His estimate is it's going to take about 2 weeks to do it, and he needs fuel every day. So there's still a logistical hurdle of supplying fuel and not ending up with, beaten in road to the equipment. So we're still looking at logistics of that. Otherwise, we've been pecking away at smaller stands of low density tamarisk between the Bedrock Boat Launch and the cement bridge, as well as using the strike teams to continue to chase secondary weeds. And we're starting to see some positive results on that in some places that I've been. That's about all I've got going here. Emily, did I miss anything big?
No, that sounds like all that's going on. I guess I just want to mention that for next year, pending some of those funding sources coming through, we're looking at doing a pretty big push in that wilderness study area. So I guess a lot is pending with that, but hopefully we can get some float access, tamarisk removal done in the WSA, pending funding and flows. But so yeah, that's on the ticket, and then hopefully we get a good 8 to 10 weeks of horse packing work in the fall as well. So yeah, we're definitely ramping up in there, which is exciting. Some of the last sort of hard to reach gamers that we haven't really touched yet. So it's exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much to all the offices for providing updates. I know this has been a tricky year with the pandemic and fires. So yeah, we appreciate you all still taking time to put resources on the Dolores and deal with Emily and I about bothering you all the time. Cool, so we're a little ahead of schedule. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them now. And yeah, we'll roll over to talk to Kevin Hyatt and our hydrology consultants, and they'll provide an awesome presentation on the great work that they've done. Let's see, I'll switch presenters. Also, we'll have Shannon put a link to the hydrology study in the chat box. I sent it out in some previous emails, but just so folks have it if they're interested. Let's see, where are you, Corey? Kevin, do you want to kick us off with some background on the hydrology assessment and the need for it?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Kevin Hyatt. Is my audio coming in there?
Yep.
Okay. So again, my name is Kevin Hyatt. I'm the hydrologist here in the Grand Junction field office. And I've been here in the field office for about 5 years now. And there's been a lot of great work occurring on the Dolores River within our field office. And a lot of that had been initiated and completed prior to my arrival. And during my time here, there were often other projects being proposed or other things going on in the Dolores River. And often I was asked, what do we think about this specific vegetation treatment? How about this diversion structure? What do we need to do with that? How about fish habitat? What are we doing for that? So there was a lot of questions that were being raised or brought to my attention that I needed to think about. And as a hydrologist and a physical scientist, my first thought goes to, well, what's the system doing? What's controlling the system? What are flows doing? That sort of thing. So one of the things that I often heard was, well, the flows are now controlled, or the flows we're seeing in the lower Dolores here are controlled by the San Miguel River. And I'm thinking, well, what does that really mean? Do we have research or have there been studies on this out there? And of course, there's been bits and pieces and information derived and collected out there to help substantiate this discussion. But I really wanted to know for myself. So I'm like, well, the best way to do this is we need to do some hydrologic modeling. And in our BPSS system, which is a funding mechanism here at the BLM that we can put in for projects each year, I had submitted a proposal a few years back in 2018, actually, in our wild and scenic rivers theme. Although this portion of the river isn't wild and scenic designated, it has some qualities that would lead it down that road. So we got to talking with our conservation area folks and wild and scenic folks, and we got to thinking and collaborating. And I said, well, I think where we need to start is really to just kind of understand the flows in the system. And so what I was really trying to do is put together a study that would answer the question is, is the channel forming flows occurring in the lower Dolores River really controlled by the San Miguel River? And then how do those, base flows or those 2-year flows or channel forming flows, how are they really impacted by releases in the river? Because during my 5 years here, we've seen a couple of releases at higher flows due to some good snow years. And, what's that really doing to our system? So this BPS project was sitting in the system, and one Friday afternoon, I got a call from the Washington office saying, hey, I've got some extra money. I see this BPS proposal in your system. What do you think about putting that money towards the project that you proposed in the system? And I said, great, we can make it happen. So we took the plan I initially developed inside the BPS system. I reached out to some folks I knew. We had a short time to spin this. I knew we had a great partner in Rivers Edge West, someplace that we could put the money to use, have them help with this project. And so we did that, and as the project started to evolve initially, we really talked about hydrology, and then we really started talking about, well, how could this be useful for folks, not just in answering the questions that I've mentioned, but to, really be a useful product down the road. And that's kind of how it morphed into, along with some of my other ideas about, let's start with the hydrology and then start thinking about some of the other habitats and ecosystems and the ecology of the system. And eventually we wanted to, develop this hydrology model that would lead into a greater plan that would help folks to address some of these questions that were being brought up about the impacts or the effects, positive or negative, to these projects. And so I reached out to Corey Foreman. He was a consultant that I had worked with in a previous job, and I knew the quality of work and the great ideas he would bring to the project. And so we reached out to him, and he's working for HDR now, and he then further helped develop some ideas and thoughts on what we could do with this. He built a great team within HDR to help develop this project. And so we took the funding that I got. It was somewhere around $80,000 or $90,000, and as with all pots of money, it didn't quite go as far as we'd hoped. But I think what we got out of it at the end of the day was a really good hydrologic analysis, some additional thought into how we can keep building on this plan, this kind of guide of, here's what you should think about before you start proposing projects, kind of deal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey and his team and let you talk about how he spent the money.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Yeah, my name is Corey Foreman. I have to ask right off the bat, make sure everybody can hear me, right? I'm coming through.
Yep, you're coming through. Thanks, Corey.
Good. Okay. Yeah, my name's Corey Foreman. I work for HDR. As Kevin mentioned, Kevin and I worked together kind of in both of our past lives on watershed assessments and watershed management type projects. I've been working in the watershed management and assessment world now. I was just doing the math in my head. It's 2020, so it's not that hard to do it for about 20 years, which blows my mind that it's been that long. And so when Kevin reached out to us, it was an exciting opportunity for us to get involved in and to spend some time up front trying to think through, what is the purpose and need, and where are we going with this project? What do we hope to accomplish? And so we outlined the goals that you can see on the screen now, and they're really twofold. Kind of the focus of this phase of the project is to really look at the hydrology of the Dolores River watershed system. This is not the start of an effort. Obviously, the folks on the phone or on this call and meeting today, there's been a ton of work that's been done by everybody in the room for the past. And, and just focusing on the hydrology is also not the end point either. Really to really get to good watershed restoration and watershed management efforts, I think you have to look at the hydrology along with the geomorphology of the system, as well as the ecology of the system, to really make informed decisions. And so at this phase, we were focused more on the hydrology, and that's really the point of bullet 1 there. However, recognizing that a lot of work had been done by others, we needed to make sure we took the appropriate amount of time to summarize and review that past work, but we also saw this as an opportunity to update some of the hydrologic analysis that sometimes was done 15 years ago. In 2005, there was a major effort. We now have 15 years more data to look at to really hone in on what are the conclusions when you look at the hydrology. So we wanted to take this as an opportunity to provide a tool to everyone on the phone today, private landowners, federal agencies, and the general public, you know, a kind of one-stop shop of a summary. You could look at this and say, well, what has been done in the past? It's a high-level summary, and then with links to, you know, the past work. So if you want to dive into more detail or dive into the weeds to come to your own conclusions, you have the ability by picking up our document to go and find those other sources of information. That's also true with the geodatabase. We tried to compile a lot of different information into one kind of a one-stop shop, provide that tool to Rivers Edge West and to RECA. So all of the information that we used in our analysis is available to others in one location.
Corey, I think you might have muted on accident.
Okay, this GoToMeeting, there's always, you know, fun things with technology. Apparently I hit the space bar and it mutes, so correct me if I do that, point that out if that happens again. So thank you, Rika.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so I'm going to step back. Our assessment really focused on three main tasks. The first one I've described or talked about a little bit. We did the literature review and summarize the past work. Second, we wanted to focus on the watershed characterization, which, you know, the characterization and the form of the watershed really influences the form of the river. So it becomes really the foundation of every watershed assessment I've ever been a part of. And that really is the focus, you know, is where you compile the information into that single database source. So, and then the third one, and is really the key part of this project, was the hydrologic assessment. Today, I'm going to briefly touch on the first two, because many of the folks on this call and in this meeting today really are more familiar with the past work, and you all know the nature of your watershed. So not a lot of time needs to be spent on that. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the hydrology. Okay. So diving into the literature review. This is the only slide I have on the literature review. Just know that we tried to look at each of these different areas and kind of summarize it. You know, the focus areas, we looked at the history. Obviously, this watershed has a long history of water management, with the early diversions taking place well over 100 years ago, and with the Montezuma Valley Irrigation Company. And so that was a fascinating part of this project, less technical, just to learn up and do a history paper, so to speak. So it was a lot of fun. We spent a lot of time compiling the hydrologic data, stream flow and water quality data, compiling that into a single database, and then reviewing the work that had been done by others. We looked at the geomorphology at a high level. That is one area, along with the ecology, I think can be expanded upon, really linking those three data sets together. We briefly described water quality, and then we also looked at kind of the operations of the system as a whole and water rights. And I should step back, and I'm doing a lot of talking for this presentation today, but this really was a truly team effort. And I do appreciate all the help we got from Kevin, in particular on the operations and water rights. Rico was very valuable to the team and helped draft up that section, building on some of her work. If I remember right, part of your master's thesis, is that correct? Sure.
Yep.
If you're on
Yep,
mute.
that's correct. That was fun to get to help with those kind of portions. So yeah, really good project.
And then lastly, I need to recognize Kayla Rainey is our water resource engineer in Denver, who really led a lot of the on-the-ground work, compiling really this entire presentation and the report. And Kayla was actually going to do this presentation today, but she had a conflict come up that she could not get out of at 10 o'clock. So if I talk long enough, Kayla was going to try to join for the question and answers. So hopefully she'll be on. If we get any detailed questions, she might know those a little bit better than myself. The other caveat I should probably point out at this point is, we originally, we did this work throughout 2019. I think this actual presentation was developed in January or February 2020. I actually had to change the date on the header slide last night because we had originally planned to present this in April 2nd of 2020. So 6 months later, I really do appreciate the opportunity to engage and talk to this group. But in the last 6 months, our memories might be a little bit fuzzy. So hopefully the questions aren't too difficult. So that was the literature review. Leave it at that. Talk about the watershed characterization. I'm not going to talk a lot about the data, just kind of what data sets were looked at. Obviously, we looked at the topography of the watershed, which, does range quite a bit from elevations above 14,000 feet in the southwest and the mountains on the upper portions of the watershed down to a low of just over 4,000 feet of elevation near the confluence with the Colorado River. We looked at the hydrologic soil groups. We looked at the soils data to some level, compiled and presented that information. Right now on the middle screen, you can see my mouse. Those are the hydrologic soils groups, which relate to the amount of runoff that you would expect, where, from, A soils or more spongy type soils that are going to absorb a lot more versus D soils, which are going to lead to a lot more runoff. And we looked at the precipitation as well. We looked at, the range and variability across the watershed and precipitation for the average annual, but we also looked at the differences in different types of events. So this is not average annual precipitation we're showing on the screen now. We looked at the return interval of certain key events. In particular, this figure is the 100-year 24-hour storm event. You can see how that ranges from, about 2 inches at a 100-year event in the center part of the watershed to, up to 5 to 6 inches in some of the mountain areas. So there's quite a range in variability, which I think everybody on the phone is probably well aware of, in precipitation. And we also looked at the land ownership, just to characterize where the public lands, where the private lands. We linked that to the land use, which, forest lands versus range lands, and etc. And then we did describe and try to summarize the geology of the system as a whole. Right here, we're showing the rock age, the different formations, and we have a summary in there from the different types of formations, from the Precambrian basement, so to speak, to some of the sedimentary layers and some of the igneous intrusions that occur throughout the watershed. Again, I'm not going to go into that in any detail. Just be aware of, we compiled this information. It is part of the database we provided as a product for this project. So kind of the heart of what we were looking at today is the hydrologic assessment. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, we were looking at, kind of 3 main things on this project. The impacts the McPhee Dam has had on the watershed's overall hydrologic regime. I mean, in kind of the way Kevin described it, is everybody knows that hydrology changes when you build a dam. That is not disputed, but what we really wanted to do is provide, some definition on that. How has it changed? And be able to quantify some of those changes. And we want to look at different flow regimes as well. So what were the changes on the low flows compared to the high flows? Another question that Kevin had brought up, I think he talks about, is, the influence of the San Miguel River. If the Dolores River is really low and you have high flows in the San Miguel, downstream of the confluence, the Dolores River just becomes an extension of the San Miguel. And intuitively, I think these things get discussed a lot, but we wanted to provide some metrics to, truly describe and quantify that influence. And then lastly, we want to look at how the current hydrology impacts the form and function of the Dolores River. That is something we kind of scratch the surface of through the hydrologic analysis, but that really requires a more in-depth look as well of the geomorphology, trying to look at how the form and function of the river may have changed over time, which was not part of this phase. So really that part, and I'll end the presentation with that. It's just a very high level look at channel forming flows. Okay, so the overall hydrologic regime. the first thing we did is we implemented an IHA analysis, which is the indicators of hydrologic alteration. That was kind of the core of our assessment for this project. And, you know, this is nothing new. There was a study, a project completed in 2005 that we were really doing an extension of and trying to build on that work in 2005 with some updated data sets. We utilize software developed by the Nature Conservancy to characterize the hydrology. And the purpose of the IHA analysis is really, it is set up to look at how a flow regime has been impacted, looking at the last bullet, pre and post, you know, change. You know, so, you know, it really sets up well for building a reservoir, because that is a discrete, an exact point in time, so to speak. You know, the year it was constructed and started to operate, you can look at what the hydrology was before then, what was the hydrology after then. And it looks at metrics that have been determined to be ecologically relevant. So it calculates, and I'll dive into this more in a minute, a lot of different hydrologic metrics to look at, but it was built in such a way that you're looking at the ones that matter most to decision makers and managers for looking at managing the Foreman function, the riparian zones of the river, and the ecology. My oversimplification of the IHA is it is the tool that calculates the metrics. But when you look at two metrics, there's a different tool I'll talk about in a minute that really helps you quantify the level of change in relation to the natural variability. When looking at the IHA analysis, and I apologize, I can't remember the exact number. It's like it's 50 or 60 different metrics, or maybe even 90. It's a big spreadsheet. All of the metrics are included at the back of our report, because a lot of what we did was to report the change, report the numbers, but decision makers on the ground, managers, may look at it and connect to something different. We want you to be able to use this data to provide the most value to you. So all of the metrics are included, and what I'm talking about today is a pretty quick summarization. The categories of the metrics that are analyzed, it really breaks down into 5 groups. You know, the magnitude, you really look at the monthly water conditions, I guess, the high flows and low flows, or the average conditions, median conditions by month. And everything you're doing, you're calculating for the pre-impact, and in this case, the impact being the construction of the McPhee Reservoir, and post-impact after McPhee Reservoir. We look at the magnitude and duration of the annual extreme events. So you look at how large are the floods, pre-impact and post-impact. You also look at the dry impact, the dry periods as well. What, you know, the low flow time periods, and you average those things. You're looking at anywhere from a 1-day average to a 90-day average. You're looking at a base flow index, which becomes important later, for the 7-day minimum flow in relation to the mean flow each year. You look at the timing of the events, you know, are those peak flows or are those dry periods happening earlier or later when compared to the pre-impact data? You look at the frequency and the duration of those high and low flows. Now, how often are they occurring? And then lastly, we looked at, these metrics lumped into the rate and frequency of water condition. That's, if you think of a hydrograph, a really flashy system, rises really quickly, and really the hydrograph will, you know, decrease and then go back to base flows very quickly, versus over a larger system or something that's been attenuated, the rise may take longer to get to the peak and longer to decrease. And so it looks at the rate of rise and the rate of the fall, and looks at pre and post impact. Are there changes there that we're seeing? That is the metrics. So then the next step on this is we used a range of variability approach, or the RVA method. And this is to look at each one of those metrics and to classify the level of difference you see. Did it change a lot, or did it really not change very much at all? That's, again, an oversimplification, but I think it's a pretty good description. And it looks at those changes, again, in post-impact, the time periods. Really, for this analysis, we want to make sure we have 20 years of data, and that becomes critical. And the next thing is, it does compare the changes pre and post-impact. It does incorporate a look of the natural variation. And we're going to see that before we know. I think everybody intuitively knows a dam reduces peak flows, but peak flows have a lot of variation anyway. So it may not, and we saw this, it wasn't the RVA method or classification of the change wasn't as high as some of the low flows when you start to account for that variation that occurred pre-McPhee Reservoir. So those were the methods. Where did we get our data from? I think I had a slide earlier I forgot to talk about, and I apologize. There were 17 total gauges in the watershed. Some of those gauges were had data only before McPhee Reservoir, so obviously you can't use them here, or some of them had data only from after McPhee Reservoir was constructed. And I think I just mentioned, we really are targeting you in order to really have good confidence in your comparisons. Ideally, you would like to have 20 years pre-impact and 20 years post-impact. Post-impact, we're at 35 years at the time of analysis, so we have a good data set there. The pre-impact amount of data in McPhee Reservoir varies quite a bit, but for 4 of the 5 gauges, we had a lot of data. One of the gauges, which was really in some ways the most critical one, we only had 13 years of pre-data. So the 5 gauges were the Dolores River near Cisco, at the downstream end of the watershed. The one with the limited amount of data is the Dolores River at Bedrock, just upstream of the confluence with the San Miguel River. We looked at there are 2 gauges upstream of McPhee Reservoir, the Dolores River at Dolores and the Dolores River below Rico are the 2 uppermost sites. And then we also want to look at the San Miguel River for reasons I've already described. So we looked at the San Miguel River near Placerville, Colorado. Okay. So what did we see? Well, and to go back, you may ask the question of, actually, I'm going to go back. You may ask the question of, why are we looking at the upper ones? Hopefully, and the reason is, if I'm going to describe changes downstream, if you do not look at the watershed upstream, it is impossible to tease out any changes that may have occurred within a watershed for reasons outside the impact we're looking at, in this case, McPhee Reservoir. So it is important to have what we're classifying as uninfluenced gauges. So we have 2 of them in the Dolores. The San Miguel obviously is not influenced, by the construction of McPhee. And so we have 3 uninfluenced, and we have 2 that are influenced, i.e. downstream of the McPhee Reservoir. So that's how we're going to look at the results kind of moving forward from this point. It is interesting to note that when we look at the uninfluenced Dolores River, I think our official conclusion is essentially things are the same, but there are minor differences. In both data sets, there were slight increases in the medians. There were slight increases in the interquartile ranges. However, in both of the uninfluenced Dolores River gauges, upstream of McPhee, the average actually decreased when you're looking at pre and post reservoir construction. And just to make sure I take a moment to show it, what the box plots, for those, I think most people are probably familiar with them, but the bottom of the box is the 25th percentile data. The line in the middle, that's the median of the data, and then the 75th percentile is the top of the box. And then the average of the data sets are shown in the yellow dots. And for all of the gauges, each kind of graph I have up here is the pre and post impact of that data for that individual gauge. So the 2 on the left are the uninfluenced Dolores gauges upstream of McPhee. You see a similar pattern. I'm going to jump to the San Miguel, where essentially the pattern is the same, where the medians have increased. However, in the San Miguel, over that same kind of time period, you actually saw a slight increase in the average. So some of those large events are still occurring and have even got a little bigger, whereas some of the large skewing events in the Dolores River watershed have actually decreased. But for the most part, the uninfluenced gauges, and this is what we like to see, are very similar, for the most part the same. So as expected, the influenced gauges, the Dolores River at bedrock, you see the biggest change. You also see change, significant change downstream of the San Miguel confluence at the Dolores River near Cisco. But as expected, the changes aren't quite as extreme because you do have that kind of averaging or balancing influence of the San Miguel at that downstream reach. What I found very interesting though is you actually, when you compare the pre and post, the 25th percentile of the data and the median flows actually increased after the reservoir was constructed. However, those higher flows, and this is the part that I think is pretty intuitive when you build a reservoir, the 75th percentile flow has decreased, and there was a fairly dramatic decrease in the average flows in the Dolores River. That part I understood. I don't know if I would have really expected the median flows to go up. If you think about it, it does make sense. But when it is almost counterintuitive to when I talked about the minimum flows. So keep that in mind for just a moment. Okay, so the previous graph is really just looking at and graphically displaying the IHA metrics. Now, like I said, there was numerous metrics that were calculated. You use the RVA method, it calculates a hydrologic alterations metric, and it classifies those into really it's a percentile of change, so to speak, and where it's 0 to 33, you're really low change, or we're going to say for all practical purposes, no change or minimal change from pre and post impact. Then you have the median change. That's you have a moderate influence, moderate change in the system. And then if your HAs are classified as high, you have significant change in the system. So, hopefully pretty straightforward. As I mentioned before, the Dolores River, most of the metrics calculated upstream of McPhee Reservoir are in that low range. You did have some metrics, about a third, 27% of the metrics we calculated did show a moderate level of change. So just to say no changes have occurred upstream of McPhee, that is not true. The Dolores River at bedrock is, upstream again of the San Miguel. That's where you saw the highest level of change, again, to be expected. And then as you go farther downstream, the influence of the San Miguel kind of dampens that change. So you still have change. You see 12% of them are classified. The metrics are significant. So I want to dive a little bit more into where did we see that change? I do want to talk just briefly about the uninfluenced gauges. I said there is some level of change. Some factors that could have influence. The watershed just as a whole is probably not the same today as it was 50 years ago. Forest management has changed, forest growth, fire suppression, all sorts of factors, climate change or climatic differences from the last 25 years compared to the previous 25 years. All of those things can account for that change. We did not analyze what was different, on those 27% that showed moderate change. We didn't really dive into that much. So we just recognize that things do impact watersheds on a natural basis. And we're not going to talk about it beyond that at this point. So if I look at, these are the top 10 metrics that showed the most significant change in the Dolores River. And again, now I'm only focusing on the influenced gauges. So the 2 gauges downstream of McPhee Reservoir. Just in general, as I've said, I think a few different times now, the Dolores River at bedrock is going to show the highest amount of change. You have less change the further you go down the system, in particular below the San Miguel. So I'm going to really focus on the Dolores River at bedrock. What's interesting is that some of the highest change of the 60 some parameters that we calculated and evaluated, you saw increases in flow in both July and December. I guess that kind of surprised me, and people can have different interpretations of that. Whereas July increased significantly, and in August, you see a significant decrease after the construction of McPhee. And I think that's, you just have to look at the operations of the reservoir and the timing of releases of it to understand that. The part that somewhat surprised me, I had to think about, and you know, really when you look at this many metrics and this many graphs, I think we had numerous conversations with Rika and Kevin and Kayla and myself, you know, trying to look at the data any way we could, looking at it crossways to make sure we understood what we were seeing. And again, just showing the snapshot of it here, but a lot of the metrics that showed the highest level of change is after McPhee Reservoir was constructed, the low flows and the average low flows over, you know, just 1 day, 3 day, or 7 days, 30-day average, and the base flow index all showed the highest levels of change. So when it is dry below McPhee Reservoir, it is drier than it's ever been, so to speak. Don't take that as an absolute, but that's where you see the biggest level of change in hydrology is on those low flow time periods. However, those low flow time periods, while they are lower than they used to be, they don't happen as frequently. And remember, this is counterintuitive to what I just said a couple slides ago, because actually the median flows have somewhat increased post McPhee Reservoir construction. So while the medians increase, the typical conditions have increased, the extreme events have gotten lower. There's a lot of words on this slide, and I'm not even sure I can do them justice in the 1 minute I'm going to spend on it. But so we tried to summarize the 2 gauges, and you know, in general, what did we see when we looked at the 5 categories of IHA metrics? In general, when you look at the monthly patterns, some months were higher, in particular July and August that I just showed, whereas, or excuse me, not July, July and December are higher post-construction, whereas August and September are significantly lower post-construction. The magnitude and duration of annual events showed significant change, and generally speaking, especially on the high events, well, the high and the low events, you've seen a decrease. The dry periods are even drier, or I shouldn't say that. The low flow periods have even lower flows than they did before. And the peak flows likewise, and that's the part I think is the most intuitive. You're not getting as high a peak flow events that you used to have. The timing of annual events of those low flows and the high flows really just showed a decrease across the board, not in the high category. You know, the HAs were not classified as high, but they classified as moderate change, really meaning that you have shifted both the peak flows and the dry flow periods, you know, earlier in the season with the construction of McPhee Reservoir, or in the time period following McPhee Reservoir construction. And then lastly, the frequency of those low flows have also decreased with the medium alteration, kind of in that middle category. So as I already stated, the low flows are lower, but they're not happening as frequently. And then I talked a little bit about we looked at the rate of change, and you kind of get a mixed bag there. Some metrics, you know, you see an increase, some metrics you see a decrease. So I think some of these other ones are more intuitive and easier to describe the changes that have happened. So next we looked at the influence of the San Miguel River. We displayed it in multiple different ways, really 3 different ways. We broke it up by flow regime, and we looked at the percent of flow the San Miguel River has as a percentage of the combined flow downstream of the confluence. And we looked at that and compared it to the flow regimes of downstream. We compared the percentages, the flow regime of the Dolores, and we compared the percentage the San Miguel has on the downstream in relation to the flow regime of the San Miguel. And so that's complicated, that's a lot, it's really not that important. Really, I'm just gonna focus on the top right graph here, which is the percentage of San Miguel River flows at the confluence. And so, you know, what percentage of the river downstream of the confluence is attributed to the San Miguel itself. And we broke this into the flow regimes of, and if you're familiar with flow duration curves, it's somewhat set up the same way, just with box plots, where the left-hand side is the high flow regimes, the middle is the median flow regimes, and the bottom is the lowest flows. And so the box plots represent the percentage of flows, the percentage of the San Miguel, both again pre and post. And so really what did we see? That when you look at the higher flows, this first bullet says that the San Miguel represents a higher percentage of the flow in the high flow regime after the construction of the dam. I think, again, fairly intuitive. You're capturing those peak flows. So the volume, when you have a large snow event, snow melt event, when the snow starts to come off in the spring, it's watershed wide. Some of that snow melt is going to be captured in McPhee Reservoir, and therefore, you're getting less volume of water going through in those high flow time periods, whereas that's not happening in the San Miguel. So the volume of water in the San Miguel compared to the downstream flows has increased. However, I think what is not really intuitive is in the middle and bottom 25% for both of those, percentage of water attributed in those flow regimes to the San Miguel has decreased. And really, when you get to the lower flows, the San Miguel actually has less influence now on the Dolores River than it did before the construction of the reservoir. And so, again, this is where it gets complicated. While the low flows that don't happen as frequent as they used to have gotten lower, in general, you have higher median flows, so you have higher base flows than you throughout the year. This is not broken down by month, and I think if we did a monthly analysis, our eyes would go cross by the time we got done looking at these graphs, but I think you'd see differences from month to month. So again, remember, this is all of the flows, all flows all throughout that 20-year, actually 35-year time period. So, but it has the San Miguel's influence has decreased in lower flows. I think we'll move on. Lastly, this is, I think I just have one quick slide. I think in some ways, this is really just to help facilitate potential future phases of this effort, or to help provide a tool to other decision makers or managers, or really to everybody as part of this group. We did want to look at the channel forming discharge, really looking at the channel forming flow as being the 2-year discharge. We used a Hydraulic Engineering Center, Corps of Engineers package, SSP, a statistical package, to look at the 2-year return interval. And so while the 2-year return interval doesn't seem like a big flood, remember that is quite a bit different. That happens once every, 700 days, plus a little. So it's still not a very frequent event, whereas the medians have increased even at that 2-year event. The ones that really form the channel morphology, those have decreased significantly. Again, I think that's pretty intuitive, but now we can somewhat quantify that. At the gauge of the Dolores River at bedrock, we've seen a 49% decrease in the 2-year channel forming event. And so we didn't look a lot at the geomorphology. We didn't do any new work, I should say. We reviewed the past work. But when I hear, talk of the channel is getting, narrower, it's, more defined, more permanent vegetation on the bank, I think that relates directly to this 49% decrease in that 2-year flow. So you're just not getting outside of the banks as much. You're not inundating that riparian area, and and so you're allowing some of that vegetation to take hold and really armor that bank into place. I believe there's another effort taking place. I don't think we're talking about it today at Colorado Mesa University, that they're looking at aerial imagery. It was something we talked about in this project, and they volunteered to do, to look at channel migration using historic imagery, and I haven't heard how that's going. So kind of in summary, this is my conclusion slide. The upper Dolores has seen a decrease in average flow. However, there's been a slight increase in median flows since the McPhee construction. And obviously, upper Dolores means above McPhee. So this is not related to the water operations or management through the reservoir. Some changes have occurred, but really they're minimal. for the most part. Below McPhee, lower minimum flows are occurring. You're having less and shorter pulses over time. They don't occur as often, and the peak flows are occurring earlier in the season. The San Miguel is a larger influence on the higher flows. McPhee is capturing those high flows, attenuating those peaks. So during the high flow time periods, Miguel is a larger influence. However, the San Miguel has a smaller percentage of the lower flows, the base flows. So while the lows are getting lower, overall the water, as the volume of water as a whole has increased below McPhee Reservoir. So the influence of the San Miguel is less in those flow regimes. And you know, something I meant to point out, and it is important for this whole context of this study, is the IHA analysis is really set up to do, you know, pre and post impact, you know, really to look at natural conditions versus impacted conditions. And the very first slide we talked about the history with diversions out of the Dolores River taking place, you know, over 100 years ago. So we're really not looking at natural flow conditions in the Dolores River. And I just want to make sure everybody knows that we recognize that fact, but we are looking at changes in water management that occurred and changes of stream flow that occurred with the construction of McPhee Reservoir. And with that, I'd love to hear questions, or I would really love to get discussion. Originally, this was meant to be part of a stakeholder workshop, a working group to talk about and think through what all this means. And obviously that was scheduled to happen on April 2nd. 2020 has been a crazy year, so I just appreciate everybody's time today.
Great, thank you so much, Corey. That was awesome. Yeah, just if folks have questions, feel free to put them in the box, or if you want to just unmute yourself and ask, that's totally fine too. I will say that, you know, this sort of information is really helpful for a lot of folks as we go to try to be more informed with what vegetation is doing, both passive and active. This is really helpful, so we can kind of know what to expect with any overbank flooding or peak flows, and you know, kind of what the likelihood of those events are. And even though there's some anecdotal evidence out there, it's great to have some hard data behind it. Also, you know, this stuff is helpful for logistics as we do some raft-based work on the Dolores in Utah, as well as in the WSA. That's also really important as it informs scheduling and crews and funding. So that's just on our side about why this information is valuable, because yeah, a river is not much without water. So with that, do we have any questions?
I put everybody to sleep, I think.
Rika, this is Rusty. I have a question.
Go for it, it's Rusty.
So I was listening, and so I guess just trying to rephrase a couple of them. So below the San Miguel, you said that the lower flows were lower, but the overall amount of water going through the Dolores is more. But will that be in a time frame that it will do any work for us, like reset zones or anything like that, or is that yet to be determined? And I'm just asking that question, you know, due to, you know, dams being established, and we know that channels do narrow and vegetate heavily, both from a non-native and native standpoint. So I don't know, there's probably a lot of questions in there, but is below the San Miguel likely to continue to or will narrow and further vegetate the sides of the river?
Well, I think that's a great question, and there's a couple of comments I want to make. And Kayla Rainey has joined us, by the way, so she has thoughts. Kayla, please, or Kevin, please jump in. Rika at any time. First, I want to say I might have technically misspoken a little bit there when I said the volume has increased. You know, the metric that I was specifically referring to is the medians have increased. So
Okay.
I don't want to make any implications to water rights, and that wasn't your question. That, you know, wow, are we letting more volume of water go down below? That maybe not quite true. It could be, but the median flows in general, the medians over the entire year have increased. But to get to the heart of your question, you know, will they continue to armor or anchor? I think that's still to be determined. The San Miguel, you know, is, you know, it does have an influence. So, you know, just in general, the base flow considerations, and I took a slide out just because it was a little bit arbitrary. There was some work done by the Bureau of Rec in 2018 about giving some base flow considerations. And, you know, and I think we kind of came to the conclusion that they're more likely, those recommendations by SPEES in 2018 are going to be easier and more likely to be met. You know, I just pull it up. This is the one I hid because I just wasn't quite sure how to talk to it. They're more likely to be hit below the San Miguel because you do have those unconfined flow events, more frequent flow events coming through the San Miguel, but they're still going to be dampened because, you know, the lower portions of the river were a combination of the two flows, especially like on a snow melt or, you know, a basin-wide storm event. You know, the flows will come together to hit that peak. But downstream of the San Miguel, you're in better shape. Upstream of the San Miguel, it's going to be harder to hit these base flow considerations, just in general, without operational management change. And we're not arguing or evaluating or making recommendations for any management changes. All we're doing is reporting the metrics to decision makers. So I think it takes a little bit more work is really my answer on that. And I think you have to look at the hydrology along with the ecology and the geomorphology. And that piece of the project, when Kevin and I first started talking about this, you know, and the work we've done in the past, you've looked at all three of those things to help you write a watershed management plan or a watershed restoration or stream restoration plan. So this is really just the first step and hopefully the foundation for that future work.
Rusty, this is Kevin Hyatt. You know, that's the exact question that I'm really trying to get at is what is this thing going to continue to do, and what are those dimensions? You know, when we go to think about doing in-stream channel restoration projects, you know, like improving side channel habitat or these sort of things, or, you know, doing whatever it may be, where we are actually altering the physical components of the Dolores River, what values do I use to come up with my design? You know, are we, you know, you know, there are some natural channel design principles out there that use bank full flows and the associated measurements with those. Well, what are those to be expected in the future, or what are they now? And that way we have a better idea of what those values are, right? Is it going to be a narrow or deeper channel? Is it wider, more sinuosity? What are these changes in flows doing to that, to those pattern dimensions and profile of the Dolores River, so that we can do better restoration?
Yeah. Well, thanks. This is great information, right, getting us down the road of knowing more about what the hydrology is on the Dolores. So thanks for all your guys' work.
You're welcome. Thank you as well for the information from this entire team that really laid the foundation for all of this.
It looks like we have a question from Ryan with CBW. He's a water specialist that manages the native fish down there. And he is wondering if the assessment accounts for the year 2000 when the Dolores project was fully online. And what he's referring to is the project was built in the mid to late 80s, but all of the canals and diversion structures weren't completed and online until 2000. So yeah, you guys can probably speak to that better than I can. I know we discussed it, but I don't think that it played a role in that IHA analysis, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that might be a good question for Kayla to weigh in on as well. She's the one that actually ran the tools and developed the metrics. But I think what Rika said was fundamentally right. You know, in order to get a long period of data, and it could be viewed as, and I wouldn't argue, it could be a limitation of the analysis of the comparisons. If things were being developed continuously from 84 through 2000, and you really didn't have all the diversions in place, and if water was being diverted, you could do a separate analysis just on 2000 to 2020 and compare that to the pre-1984. I do not believe we did that. I think we looked at just the pre-McPhee and post-McPhee and lumped everything together, which if we just narrowed down to 2000, the concern with doing that would be that you're shortening, you have less data available. So like a decadal cycle or typical climatic cycles from drought periods to wet periods could have a bigger influence on your analysis, and so you may start to show artificial changes just because of that. So generally we wanted to use more data, but I think the point of this question is, yeah, you might not be capturing some of the changes because things weren't completely allocated. Kayla, do you have anything to add to that? Did I answer that fundamentally correct?
Yeah, I agree with your response. And I guess just simply our pre-impact period was anything before and during 1983, and our post-impact period was 1984 to present.
Great question. Thank you.
So to add to that, that was kind of the whole desire to have this discussion amongst the working group of folks. If that's something that we, may understand the limitations and the potential, for lack of a better term, representativeness of that information, but it could give us a look into what that true most recent operational period fully online would be. I mean, that'd be something that we could add to the list of things that we want to do with the next round of funding. Is okay, do we like this analysis that we've done? Do we think this answers the questions we want? Now let's maybe look at it in a different time period and put that on the list of things to do. And that's good to hear from the group. So I think it might be a potential.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. I'll keep note of that for the future. Another thing, Corey, you had mentioned the professor who had a student looking at aerials, and I haven't seen the product. I think he got shifted onto some other things as well. But I think he still is planning to do some of that analysis and have students do it. And I also had another professor at Fort Lewis College reach out to me about kind of a similar project. So I do anticipate that this could help out students who are interested in those kind of projects that would really go well with this, and have an aerial analysis as well as this spatial data. So it can lead to a lot of other things for sure. We have a question from Gabe. He is wondering if there are any plans to map floodplain connectivity pre and post dam, which I think we've thought about that. That could be another good one for kind of the future outputs of what this means. I think that might require kind of some tech graphs and some different kinds of analysis. I'm not a hydrologist, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, I think, again, to really get at pre and post floodplain analysis, and just using HECRAS as a potential model, inside that model, you need measured cross sections. And so, ideally we would want to see if we could find some historical cross sections and then, do some cross section measurements at those same locations to run a pre and post floodplain analysis. Again, something of interest. Is there a value at risk or a value in the watershed that we're concerned about flooding? And obviously, there's the highway. There's some homes throughout the river. So yeah, I think it's another potential question is what does this thing do when it floods now?
I completely agree. I think that question's more for you, Kevin. So, but it is something Kevin and I talked about quite a bit early on, and thinking about the future. It was definitely an option that was discussed. Any other questions? Otherwise, Rika, I think it's back to you.
Back to me. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks you both for presenting that. And yeah, I urge folks to really dig through that report. There's a lot of good information in there. Yeah, you guys have been great to work with, and we'll look forward to the future. And with that, if folks have anything else they'd like to bring up, then we can certainly do that. And then we can get to our knapweed discussion a little bit earlier, which is great. So let's see, Emily, do you have anything else before we hop over to that discussion?
Nope, I do not.
Okay. Cool, that sounds great. Well, I'm gonna give Shannon a second. She's gonna stop the recording, talk about what they're doing, what methods have worked and what isn't working, and then perhaps find some additional opportunities for coordinating. I know that's kind of happened organically, both in Utah as well as, here with Montana, with Mesa County and Marlin at Grand Junction. But I think this will be a perfect, we have a lot of good folks on the call. Justin and Grand County Weeds. So yeah, I don't know if someone has a question or anything to kick that off. Go right ahead. And yeah, Shannon says we're good to go. Oh, that's a good question. We can answer first from David. He's wondering if there have been any issues from grazing pressures on our revegetation efforts. BLM folks might be able to answer this as well. I've never really seen that on our active revegetation. I don't know if other folks have an answer to that.
This is Gabe in Moab. We see a little minor impacts, but for the most part, our section of the river is fairly remote, so we don't really see any kind of ubiquitous issues. Just a little bit as they're channeling. And by state line, there's a fence that we might need to fix that has been fixed in the past that allows cows into a portion of our restoration area. But ours is definitely very minor and very localized, so I don't really have a whole lot, I guess, to add.
This is Ken in Uncapped. I kind of agree with Gabe. We've had primarily at the Bedrock boat launch, we've had some setbacks from cattle there, but also it's very localized and not widespread.
Yeah, overall, I think the range folks do a good job of monitoring that, and yeah, it's all pretty well managed. Okay, so let's start out with maybe just knapweed treatments. I know we have them all in every single field office. Emily does a great job about coordinating this, but what sort of methods do you see that are working and aren't working, Emily?
Well,
Review.
that's a great question. Yeah, so most of our knapweed treatments that we're doing are with our strike teams. A lot of our sites we have to backpack spray just because of remoteness and access. But Kyle and Cam are able to get those UTV sprayers out on certain sites. So I think, yeah, it's tricky with the backpack spraying just because Justin Musser and I have talked about this, but there's just not as high of a volume. We're also in, the riparian area, and there's a lot of hard to get to places where the knapweed can sort of right out under brush. And so it's definitely like a repeat effort. It takes several years of repeat treatments to sort of get a handle on some of these areas. And so we've seen success for sure, but it takes, just several years usually. I could certainly dive into like the chemicals we're using, but that's kind of the overview, I suppose. If anyone has any questions about that.
Hey, Emily, this is Gabe again. I have a quick question. I know on other projects sometimes we use milestone, sometimes we use glyphosate, and I'm just curious, I guess, if you guys use a variety of different things for knapweed, or is it seasonally dependent? I guess, since we're kind of, we've done some knapweed work for sure, but I see it becoming a larger focus in the future. And so just sort of, I guess, wanting to emulate what other folks are doing in terms of their specific formulations and mixtures. Obviously don't want to reinvent the wheel there.
Yeah, so milestone seems to be the ticket. In Trace Rios, we use milestone and escort. Well, actually, no. In Trace Rios, we use transline and escort. The milestone hasn't been approved yet out there. So, and then in the Uncapped office, we're using milestone. And that's in the fall. Seems to be what we've had the best luck with is milestone. I think Kyle's tried to treat knapweed in the spring. I don't know exactly what he was using, but didn't have as good a luck. I don't know, Rika, if you know any more about that. I wish he was on this call. I don't know what he was using. Probably milestone. I think that's kind of been the standard.
Great, thanks. And have you seen any impacts to native vegetation, like, when knapweed sort of nestled up underneath like a big old cottonwood or some kind of tree that you're trying to protect or shrub? Were you able to treat right up underneath of it, or have you seen any sort of collateral damage, I guess is my ultimate question.
Yeah, not to cottonwoods. And even our shrubby species, not really, no. The backpack spraying method, they're pretty darn careful. And so, yeah, I think that collateral damage is not really something we're seeing. I personally am not like too concerned about it. I haven't really noticed it. And with our monitoring data, the sites that we have like a ton of treatments on, it seems to be the weeds themselves that are the bigger issue and, impacting the natives. So, yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So it sounds like kind of fall treatments, milestone based, probably seems to be effective. And then, with multiple retreatments, is there any sort of like number of retreatments you're seeing be successful, or is it? I mean, I'm sure it's really site based, but
Depends on how bad it is.
Yeah, it depends how bad it is. I mean, could you potentially see decent results for maybe getting some passive, grass restoration coming in within a couple of years or 5 years? Or is this a longer time scale to kind of see some tangible changes?
I'd say like 3 to 5 years, depending, obviously, but yeah, I mean, and sometimes if the site isn't too dense and already has some of that native veg in there, then a couple of years to 2 to 3 years, we start to see some significant change.
Awesome. Because one thing that we have sort of two scenarios here. One is, knapweed just in and amongst a lot of the native vegetation, in the riparian zone. We also have these old agricultural fields, fairly large, that have been invaded by knapweed since they've been left fallow. And so not a whole lot to worry about in terms of native vegetation there, but certainly a huge seed source and a huge infestation that is going to, I guess, require. And Grand Canyon Weeds has worked on that, and we made some progress in some spots, but there's certainly more to do out there. And yeah, I'm just sort of curious, do other folks have these large sort of abandoned field issues that are knapweed now, or are most people sort of dealing with, I guess, more natural systems?
Yeah, this is Ken. We have some, they must have been either old fields or possibly placer mine sites that were pretty much solid knapweed. And my anecdotal observation is that as the knapweed gets killed back, we've seen some pretty good, like, warm season grasses coming into those. Somewhat natural. A lot of sand drop seed and Hyatt grass. So one of the things Emily and I have talked about is maybe abandoning the shrub plan and just trying to get early cereal vegetation like that to take hold and kind of provide some initial competition as we slowly kill back the knapweed.
I think that's a very intelligent approach. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
We've used a lot of knapweed over the years, and I would say that exact same thing about those grass species. We see a lot of stuff, and then over the years too, you get, those early successional species moving in, but then, like on our roadsides, we start to see a lot of perennial grasses start to take off too. And going back to the question about damage to native species, woody species, and things like that. I mean, we've treated a lot of acreage with milestone, and that's not something I've seen at all, really. I mean, I've seen very, very little damage that way to native or desirable species. And I think that's definitely something worth considering to maybe hold off on active re-veg with some of those forb species and stuff if you're planning on going back and doing retreatments in some of these areas.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Yeah, one thing we've seen is that if we do an initial tamarisk removal, high disturbance, especially in really dense areas, and we've tried to seed some like native grass species right after that, and we've had really low success with that. The weeds just take over. So we've had better success with those sites essentially just planning doing knapweed treatments for 1 or 2 years, after that initial removal, and then seeding. Just a few years of treatments really makes a big difference before we seed.
There's the knapweed. I mean, there's some evidence that shows that it's kind of allelopathic too. So I think there's potential that some of, residual issues with minerals in the soil and things like that may kind of inhibit some of those re-veg efforts early on. I think the other thing to consider, I mean, it's doesn't have a very high seed viability, but those seeds are probably only viable for 2 to 3 years anyway. So I think if there's a key to any of this stuff, I think those retreatments are the key, and that can be really frustrating not to get those successes you want the first time. But I think revisiting those sites and following up is kind of the key to long-term success on any of this stuff.
I guess I have a follow-up question on that too. Are folks seeing, I guess there's a couple of things here. One, if you're working and treating knapweed, I guess within an active floodplain or below bankful, or an area that's going to get seasonally inundated fairly frequently. My question is, has anybody treated in areas like that and then just seen it get recolonized by seeds coming down from upstream? And then I guess that sort of leads to my second comment, is like my inclination would be to kind of work in areas that are maybe a little bit higher and drier now under the current hydrology, with the idea that they're not as likely to recolonize with knapweed, at least from seed source coming from the river. And so I'd just be interested in anybody's sort of comments on that.
I don't really have anything to say about like the floodplain circumstance that you're talking about specifically, but I think probably the vegetative spread of that species is your primary concern. That may be something you want to play around with rather than really focusing on those areas initially, but I don't think I certainly wouldn't suggest you hold off on doing that. If you've got areas like that are heavily inundated right now, I think it'd be well worth your time to treat those areas.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Gabe, I think you're the only one with meaningful floodplain left, maybe Grand Junction. We certainly don't. Not that colonizes, it washes away every year, so lucky you.
I wish we had more.
I know places along the floodplain in Junction that I've visited where Sparky and Kyle have historically treated. I wouldn't say knapweed has recolonized. There's always some still there, but it definitely was taken over by other annual and weedy species. So it doesn't look great, but it isn't completely all knapweed. So.
You see kochia come in, or other kinds of?
Yeah, kochia, hoary cress, all the good stuff.
Nice. Cool. Let's hang tight down here in Moab until all the upstream work's done.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much to do out there. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are good points. We can certainly kind of strategize and keep track of different floodplain and bank types and see what the differences are. There's also some areas that we've tried to do biocontrol the last few years, in Paradox Valley, and then I know Montana was working with some landowners around Gateway recently for that. That's something Ken and Emily and I briefly talked about, maybe monitoring those a little bit more closely, which I don't know what folks' interests in that are. I think it's certainly worth understanding that and working with Insectary a little bit closer. I don't know, have all field offices tried to do that? Gabe, have you done any biocontrol?
I haven't done any that I've initiated, but I know we have the gall midge down here, I believe is what it's called, and we've seen it spreading around, attacking the flowers basically. But since it is primarily promoted from vegetative below ground biomass, I don't know how. I mean, it definitely be effective in addressing the seed crop, but there's obviously that other piece that isn't addressing. But so no, I guess to answer your question, I haven't done anything, but I know that's out there. Haven't seen it make a huge dent yet, but hopefully in time it will.
Yeah, Choice Rios has some major league sites, but I haven't been to it. So I need to get with my kids and we'll follow up on those.
Yeah, Rika, we haven't done any of the follow-up monitoring on it yet, but I will. I'll be in the loop when we find out the success of year one of that project.
Cool. That sounds good. Thanks, Montana. Yeah, I'd like to follow up with the some private lands in Paradox Valley that it's been a few years and go take a look at that. I mean, yeah, I think it's important that we keep track of where those areas are in comparison to what we're treating with chemical as well. Since I don't really understand the connection there, but I think it's good to just do one or the other. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily want to do both at the same time. But talking with Kyle the other day, it sounds like the spot they're hitting now, I think he said was like 8 to 10 years, something like that, since the last treatment. So if you're going through once every 8 to 10 years, I think there's plenty of time to have some releases happen in the intermediate time.
Are you releasing the fly or the wasp, Montana?
Wasp.
I did.
Yeah, and I'm not.
I did see a gulf fly, a plant impacted by gulf fly along the Dolores off Y11 road last time I was in there. So it's moving a little bit.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, and I'm not sure of the success from one versus the other, but just in terms of timing and work with the insectary, that's the one that we ended up using.
Yeah, it's definitely out there. I've seen it. I'm curious if that's something that folks would like monitoring crews to just make note of. I mean, those crews map all the Russian knapweed infestations they find, and so yeah, if they see those galls, they can certainly make note of that if that's data that people would be interested in.
Yeah, I think that would be a pretty easy data section, just to say present, biocontrol present, yes, no kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that would be great information to have, and doesn't seem like it would be too huge of a burden.
No, not at all.
Cool.
Rika, did Tim Seastead follow up with you about coming back out and looking at those places where the gall have been released in Paradox, or did that fall by the wayside?
No, I never heard about that. That's certainly something I could reach out to someone about.
Maybe I can take the lead on that. I was working with him on study design stuff for places we've released it here in the Uncapped Valley. So maybe I'll follow up with him again and see if he still has a strong interest in that. I think it'd be interesting to understand whether or not that thing is really reducing the density at all. I think we should try to understand that to some degree as well.
They can. We have some sites right here around in Montrose that are really easy to access to. If you have any interest in going out and looking at those, they're sites you could just go out and look at periodically if it's something that interests you at all.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Justin. Lene and I put some fixed plots in where she did some releases last year, and so we're in the first, initial steps of seeing what it'll do. If we're going to go check them next spring to look and see what kind of difference we had there. But I do know that they were released in Paradox on private land and on a phenomenal stand, and it'd be a great spot to try to put something permanent in and start to see if we're we're seeing any kind of meaningful change in the density of that thing. I would get those locations from you though, Justin, whether maybe just shoot me an email. I'd definitely like to have a look at them, and we can just kind of track those too, maybe even ponder putting something in to look at those as well.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, you're welcome to it. I'll have to go map them or something to get you some points or figure out some lat one or something for you.
Great.
I was wondering if anyone's heard about the rust fungus. I got like an email from Sonia at the Palisade Insectary, and she was seeing it in some Russian knapweed field sites. I was wondering if anyone had heard of it or has it in their areas.
Rust fungus for knapweed?
Is the Canada thistle rust fungus, or is that is this a different biocontrol altogether?
I think it may be the same one, but I know Sonia was saying it. She saw it on knapweed.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's news to me.
We have some sites where it's gotten pretty well established, and it's interesting on the it's having some pretty interesting impacts on the Canada thistle, but it seems like you have to be pretty strategic about moving it around. I don't really think it moves on its own very effectively. That's what I'm seeing anyway. But it's promising on Canada thistle.
Okay.
That's interesting. Cool. Well, let's see. Do folks have any other questions or opportunities to coordinate? I mean, yeah, Emily and I are happy to help out and with any concerns or things like that to make implementation happen. So, yeah, just let us know.
I'm curious if anyone's had any luck with knapweed treatments in the spring.
I feel like I'm kind of dominating the conversation. I apologize, but we have had some successes. You know, I've heard some people say that there's kind of a treatment window where 10%, when 10% of the flower buds are actually blooming, that there's a treatment window in that time frame. But you know, we've had successes well outside of that time frame too. I just think they're less consistent in those fall applications. So Emily, when you're doing your fall treatments, you know, what is the time frame? You know, when you say fall, when are you starting?
So we start typically like first week of September. And really we get like 2 months in September, October, is sort of our time frame.
So then a lot of those plants are still, you know, somewhat green when you guys are treating. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
I think there's some evidence with those milestone treatments that it's those kind of subsurface root structures, you know, those little root crowns and nodes and things that are absorbing a lot of that chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of I wonder if that isn't some of our success. I mean, I would say we probably average 95% success on one application. And I wonder if that's it after the plants themselves have kind of died back a little bit, if we're getting just more carrier volume down to the ground where it might, the plants may be absorbing it more readily there.
So are you spraying later in the season?
Yeah, we usually start mid to end of October and we'll spray through sometime middle December. So essentially, we spray until the ground freezes or until our equipment starts to freeze.
That is an issue we have starting in November. Water tanks freeze and our crews are camping. And
yeah, I think you guys are dealing with logistical issues more than about anything. That's kind of how I see it. You got a lot of really tough sites, and it's tough to get people there. It's tough to get equipment there. I think that's a lot of your big challenges.
Yeah, we definitely have fun issues with sprayers freezing later. But that's interesting to know. Yeah, we're instructing them, like the crew when they're backpack spraying. We definitely, or I have them focus on the bottom of the plant, you know, definitely getting the, you know, the chemical towards like the ground around the bottom of the plant. And so I don't know if that really makes a difference. And, you know, we retrain people every year. So.
It sounds like you're seeing a lot of success. It's just you having to do a lot of retreatment. Is that a fair categorization?
Yeah, I mean it works. We just need to hit it several years in a row.
I think that's going to be the case.
Yeah.
It sucks to say, but I kind of think that's kind of the name of the game, I think.
Job security.
Awesome. Well, does anyone else have any other questions or ideas for before we head out? Cool. Well, yeah, we did record this last little bit if folks want to reference back to it, if they forget or anything or want to share it. And I think that Shannon wants to say something before we all head out, but thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Rika. For those of you who are still here with us, so I'm the Associate Director for Rivers Edge West, Shannon Wattis. I just wanted to give a shout out to Rika and Emily for all their hard work this year in previous years in organizing this partnership meeting. I know it's been a funky year, so it's exciting to see everyone together and to see your faces. And thanks for everyone for participating and or presenting. So that's all I wanted to say. So you guys have done a wonderful job, and we couldn't do all this work without the collaboration of everyone on this call and other people who weren't able to participate. So I'll turn it back over to you, Rika. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I think that's all we got for today. If there's kind of any subsequent meetings you'd like us to set up or field visits, that could be more fun potentially. something this fall. Yeah, just shoot us a message and we will make it happen. But thanks everybody.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick plug for those who are left. We have that feedback form that Shannon posted earlier in the chat, but yeah, virtual meetings are new for this partnership, so any feedback is much appreciated. So if you could take the time, 5 minutes to fill it out, that's very helpful. And yeah, thank you everybody for hopping on the call and for all your hard work. We definitely appreciate it.
Thanks, Rika. Thanks, Emily, for putting